Our topic is the connection between the representation of knowledge and liminal spaces. Knowledge in regions of the brain. The brain regions involved in knowledge abstraction, some prefrontal regions have been linked to the extraction of meaningful information from images and sentences. The left prefrontal region is more involved in verbal processing, while the right prefrontal region is more involved in visual processing. There is also compelling evidence that categorical information is stored in the posterior brain, particularly the temporal cortex. As information is presented verbally, there is also evidence of increased activation in the left hemisphere. Prefrontal regions of the brain are associated with meaningful processing of events, whereas posterior regions such as temporal cortex are associated with representing categorical information. We will review neuroscience data on the localization of semantic information in the brain at various points in this chapter, but our focus will be on striking results from behavioral studies that examine what people remember or forget after an event.
Memory for meaningful interpretation of events. Erich Warner, 1968. Dissertation study illustrates situations in which people remember and forget information about exact wording. Warner invited participants to the laboratory to listen and for recorded instruction. Warner's experiment has clear implication for starter memory is better for change in wording that result in change in meaning that for changes in wording that result in only changes in the style. The superiority of meaning in memory indicates that people usually extract the meaning from the linguistic message rather than remembering its exact word. Unward participants remember the stylistic chants to about the chance rate, whereas participants remember it at nearly 80% of the time.
Warner's experiment results in determining the circumstances under which people remember and do not remember information about exact wording. Participants' ability to remember a difference in wording that had an impact on meaning versus one that only affected style is plotted depending on whether or not the participant had been warned that they would be put to the test their ability to recall specific information sentences. People usually remember the meaning of a linguistic message rather than its exact wording after processing it. Memory for visual information. Our memory for visual information appears to be far superior to our memory for verbal information. Shepard, 1967, conducted one of the first experiments comparing visual memory to verbal memory. The picture memory task participants first studied a set of magazine pictures one at a time, then were presented with the pairs of pictures consisting of one picture they recognized and one picture they didn't recognize.
They were then asked to indicate which picture they had studied and which they had not reviewed. Participants in the sentence memory task studied sentences one at a time and were tested on their ability to recognize those sentences. Participants made errors 11.8% of the time on the verbal task, but only 1.5% of the time on the visual task. To put it in another way, the memory of verbal information was quite good, but the memory of visual information was almost flawless. Many subsequent experiments have demonstrated a remarkable ability to remember images. However, people's memory for pictures is not always as good. It depends on the circumstances. When studying a complex visual scene, how do people actually deploy their attention? People typically pay attention to and remember what they perceive to be the meaningful or significant aspects of the scene. This study's conclusion is very similar to Warner's 1968 experiment discussed previously.
Warner discovered that participants were much more sensitive to meaning and significant changes in a sentence. Mandler and Ricci, 1977, discovered that participants were more sensitive to meaning significant changes in a picture but not to picture details. This is not because they are incapable of remembering such details, but rather because such details do not appear to be important and thus are ignored. When people see a picture, they pay attention to and remember the details that are important to them. Importance of meaning to memory. So far we focused on memory for meaningful verbal and pictorial information, but what if the material is meaningless, such as difficult to follow written description? Consider the following passage from a study conducted by Johnson and Bransford, 1972. In reality, the procedure is quite simple. To begin, divide the items into groups. Of course, depending on how much work there is to be done, one file may be sufficient.
If you need to go somewhere else, the next step is to address the lack of facilities. Otherwise, you are set. It is critical not to overdo things. That is preferable to do. Few things at once are preferable to many. In the short run, this may not appear to be significant, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can also be costly. The entire procedure will appear complicated at first. However, it will soon become just another aspect of life. It is difficult to see any end to the need for this task in the near future, but one never knows. After the procedure is completed, the materials are reorganized into different groups. They can be placed in their proper locations. They will eventually be used again, and the entire cycle will have to be repeated. However, a natural part of life, memory works better for material if we can interpret it meaningfully. Implications of good memory for many people have a relatively good memory for meaningful interpretations of information, as we have seen.
When presented with material to remember, it will be beneficial if they can give it a meaningful interpretation. Unfortunately, many people are unaware of this fact, and as a result, their memory performance suffers. When arbitrary associations are covered into something more meaningful, they are easier to commit to memory. Propositional representations, we have demonstrated that in many situations, people remember the meaning of what they have encountered rather than the exact physical details of what they have seen or heard. In order to be more specific about what is meant, cognitive psychologists created what is known as a propositional representation by using the term meaning. Such analysis relies heavily on the concept of a proposition, which is borrowed from logic and linguistics. A proposition is the smallest unit of knowledge that can be judged as true or false. A separate assertion that is the smallest unit of knowledge that can be meaningful judged as a true or false.
The theory of propositional representation does not claim that a person remembers simple sentences like these when encoding the meaning of a complex sentence. Rather, the claim is that the material is encoded in a more abstract way. Experiment shows that although people remember the propositions they encounter, they are quite insensitive to the actual combination of propositions. According to propositional analysis, people remember a complex sentence as a set of abstract meaning units that represents the simple assertions in the sentence. The propositional representations that we have just considered are examples of what Barcelow 1999 called an amodal symbol system. By this, he meant that the elements within the system are inherently non-perceptual. The original stimulus might be a picture or sentence, but the representation is abstracted away from the verbal or visual modality. Given this abstraction, one would predict the participants in experiments would be unable to remember the exact words they heard or the exact picture they saw. An alternative to a modal representation of meaning is the view that meaning is represented as a combination of images in different perceptual modalities.
Representation of knowledge of liminal spaces. Most people find being in a liminal place to be extremely uncomfortable. The liminal space is everything but what our brains need for homeostasis and stability. If we let them, liminal places can affect your mental health. It is possible that you will come across several liminal spaces in your life. In reality, life is really a transitional period between birth and death. What is liminal space? The Latin term limen, which meant threshold, is the source of the English word liminal. It means to be on the verge of something new but not quite there, to be in a liminal area. A liminal state might be experienced physically, emotionally, or metaphorically. Example of liminal spaces. Physical liminal spaces. Example of this is hallways, doorways, trains, airplanes, airports, bridges, and empty parking lots. This example is the easiest one. You often pass through actual liminal spaces without even knowing it because you only remain there shortly. Picture an elevator. You ride an elevator to move from one floor to another. And most of the time, you don't think twice about it. What happens though if you're trapped in an elevator? Then your mind can start to wander with images from scary movies that you see and watch on television. Remember in the scenes in the show that when you're stuck in an elevator, there might be someone inside that you can see. You'll have the idea that staying in a small space is very uncomfortable.
Emotional liminal spaces, it consists of divorce, graduation, illness, and moving. You could think of liminal space as a transitional period. People will encounter lots of different liminal places. There are some that are longer and are harder than others, but it always comes to an end. It develops into anxiety about running out of emotional needs, which goes beyond the fear of uncertainty. Metaphorical liminal spaces, you might also imagine having to pick between two options. It's possible that you have to decide between going out with your romantic partner and your best buddy. You are in a liminal situation up until a decision is made. Stress hormones may be generated in your system as a result of your fear of the unknown, making it even harder to breathe. On the other side, liminal spaces can feature beauty, considering structural liminal spaces such as a spectacular fountain in a building's entrance. Thank you for watching, and we hope to hear from you guys.